The red dust of Carson Gulch hung in the air like a curse that summer of 1876. It settled on everything: the warped planks of May's boarding house, the cracked leather of saddles, the parched throats of men who'd given up praying for rain. Eve Harper wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of that same dust across her forehead as she bent over her sewing in the dim light of her workshop. "You best hurry with that dress, Eve," May Hutch called from the doorway, her voice carrying the rasp of too many years breathing desert air. "Mrs. Whitman's expecting it before Sunday service." Eve's needle paused mid-stitch. "It'll be ready, May, always is." The older woman lingered, her weathered face creased with something more than age. "Your husband was by earlier, looking for you. Thomas knows where to find me." Eve's tone was flat as the horizon beyond town. She'd been Mrs. Thomas Hale for 3 months now, and the shine had worn off that particular badge faster than brass in alkaline water. May huffed, but said nothing more. The whole town knew Deputy Hale had married above his station when he'd convinced Eve Harper to take his name. What they didn't know was how hollow that victory rang in their small adobe house each night. The workshop door banged open, making both women jump. Thomas stood there, his deputy star catching the late afternoon light, his face flushed with more than heat. "Eve, I need your medical supplies." She set down her needle carefully. "Someone hurt?" "Not yet." His laugh was sharp as broken glass. "But there will be if that half-breed doesn't start talking." Eve's stomach tightened. She'd heard the whispers all day. Jonah Reyes, caught red-handed after the Garrison Ranch robbery. 3 men dead. They said the bank's payroll stolen. The kind of crime that brought out the worst in people, especially when the accused wore his Apache blood in the angle of his cheekbones and his Mexican heritage in his name. "What kind of supplies?" she asked, though she feared the answer. "Laudanum. Maybe something stronger. Crow wants answers before the circuit judge arrives." Randall Crow. Even his name tasted bitter, like alkali water. The man owned half the valley's cattle and all of its fear. If he wanted answers, he'd get them, one way or another. "I won't be party to torture, Thomas." Her husband's face darkened. "It's not torture, it's interrogation. There's a difference." "Not when you need my medicines to do it." Thomas stepped closer, and Eve caught the whiskey on his breath. Dutch courage, May called it, though Eve saw precious little courage in her husband these days. "You're my wife," he said, voice low and dangerous. "That means you support me, support the law." "The law doesn't require breaking a man to make him confess." "That man," Thomas spat the word, "is a killer, a savage. You've seen his face. Those scars make him look like the devil himself." Eve had seen Jonah Reyes exactly once, months ago, when he'd brought in a family whose wagon had overturned in Flash Flood Canyon. He'd stayed just long enough to ensure they were safe, then disappeared like smoke. The scars on his face had been terrible. Yes, but his hands had been gentle with the injured children. "I said no, Thomas." The slap came fast, snapping her head to the side. May gasped, but Eve just touched her cheek, feeling the heat bloom there. "You'll regret that," she said quietly. Thomas grabbed her arm. "You'll get those supplies. Or what, you'll hit me again in front of May." Eve yanked free. "Get out of my workshop." He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. May rushed to Eve's side, but Eve waved her off. "I'm fine." "Child, that man is my husband." The words tasted like ashes, for better or worse. But as darkness fell over Carson Gulch, Eve found herself walking not toward her home, but toward the temporary jail, just a reinforced shed behind Crow's largest warehouse. She carried her medical bag, the one she'd used during the range wars, when she'd learned that blood looked the same whether it came from white men, Mexicans, or Apache. Pike stood guard, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Evening, Mrs. Hale." "My husband sent me." The lie came easily. For the prisoner, Pike's grin was ugly. "About time. Crow's getting impatient." Inside, the smell hit her first blood, sweat, and fear. Jonah Reyes hung from chains bolted to the ceiling, his shirt torn away, his back a map of fresh wounds. His head lifted at her entrance, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. The scars were old, twisted tissue that pulled at his left eye and cheek, but his gaze was steady, defiant still. "Come to watch the show, Senora." Eve set down her bag. "I've come to clean those wounds." "Before they make new ones." She didn't answer, pulling out clean cloth and carbolic. His muscles tensed as she worked, but he made no sound. Up close, she could see older scars beneath the new damage. This wasn't his first dance with men like Crow. "You didn't rob the Garrison place," she said quietly. His good eye fixed on her. "How would you know?" "Because whoever did it shot 3 men in cold blood. And you're the man who saved the Hendricks family. Killers don't usually bother with such kindness." "Maybe I'm complicated." Despite everything, Eve almost smiled. "Maybe you are, but you're also left-handed, and the witnesses say the shooter favored his right." Jonah went very still. "You notice much for a seamstress." "I notice enough." She wrapped the last bandage. "They mean to force a confession from you. Crow needs someone to hang for this, and you're convenient. Foreign enough to be feared, scarred enough to be monster. And what do you propose I do about it? Senora sprout wings?" Eve glanced at the door, then back to him. Her hands shook as she reached into her bag, past the medicines, to the small knife she kept there. May's brother had taught her to pick locks during the war, when medical supplies were kept under guard and lives depended on her resourcefulness. "What are you doing?" Jonah's voice was sharp with surprise. "Being foolish." The lock clicked open. "There's a mare tied behind May's boarding house. Supplies in the saddlebags. Take the old Apache trail through Devil's Backbone. Thomas won't think to look there." Jonah dropped to the floor, catching himself on unsteady legs. "Why?" "Because I took an oath once, to do no harm." She met his eyes. "And standing by while innocent men hang seems harmful enough to me. Your husband." "My husband is many things, Mr. Reyes. But he's not the law, whatever he thinks." She pressed the knife into his hand. "Go, now, before I remember I'm supposed to be a dutiful wife." He hesitated, then touched his forehead in an oddly formal gesture. "I won't forget this." "I hope you do, for both our sakes." He slipped out into the darkness, and Eve busied herself staging the scene overturned medicine bottles, the knife placed just so, a bump on her own temple courtesy of the doorframe. By the time she screamed for help, Jonah Reyes was already a shadow among shadows, riding hard for the wilderness. Pike found her on the floor, dazed and seemingly distraught. The story came easily. The prisoner had grabbed her, threatened her, forced her to unlock his chains. Thomas arrived within minutes, his face cycling through rage, embarrassment, and something that might have been relief. "Did he hurt you?" He actually sounded concerned, though Eve suspected it was more about his reputation than her welfare. "Just frightened me." She let him help her stand, playing the shaken wife. He said Crow would never take him alive, that he knew things." Thomas and Pike exchanged glances. "What things?" "I don't know. He wasn't making much sense." She pressed a hand to her temple. "I need to go home." But home offered no peace. As Eve lay beside her snoring husband, she stared at the ceiling and thought about choices, about the ring on her finger that felt heavier each day, about a scarred man riding through darkness toward an uncertain freedom. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, the promise of rain that never came. But sometimes, Eve thought, promises were meant to be broken, and sometimes the most dangerous storms were the ones that brewed in human hearts, waiting for the right moment to break. She turned the ring on her finger, around and around, and wondered if she'd just lit a fuse that would burn down everything she'd built in Carson Gulch. Come morning, Crow would want answers, Thomas would want obedience, and somewhere in the Badlands, a man she'd freed would want justice. The dust would settle eventually. It always did. But Eve had a feeling that when it cleared, Carson Gulch would never look the same. Thunder rolled again, closer now. Still no rain, but change was coming nonetheless, riding hard on a borrowed horse, carrying secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. Eve closed her eyes and waited for the storm. The Badlands stretched before them like a broken promise, all red rock and thorny silence. Eve pressed herself flat against her horse's neck as another rifle shot cracked through the morning air. Pike's aim getting closer with each attempt. She'd left Carson Gulch before dawn, slipping away while Thomas slept off his whiskey. But Crow's men had picked up her trail faster than expected. "This way!" Jonah's voice came from her left, urgent but controlled. He guided his mount down a narrow wash, barely wide enough for a horse. Walls of sandstone rising on either side like the pages of a book written in geological time. Eve followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd never run from anything in her life, had always faced troubles head-on with needle and thread or carbolic and bandages. But here she was, fleeing into the desert with a man she barely knew, her marriage vows crumbling like the shale beneath their horses' hooves. The wash opened into a box canyon, and Jonah pulled up short, scanning the rim. "We need to go up and over. Can you climb?" "I can learn." His scarred face showed the ghost of a smile. "That's what I figured." They dismounted, and Jonah quickly hobbled the horses in the shade of an overhang. Eve watched him work, noticed how he favored his left side where Pike's men had worked him over. She'd rewrapped his wounds at their first rest, but he needed proper care. Time to heal. Time they didn't have. "Here." He handed her a canteen. "Small sips. We need to make it last." The water was warm, metallic, but it was life itself in this furnace of stone and sun. Eve rationed herself, then passed it back. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and she was surprised by the steadiness in his touch. "Why did you come after me?" he asked as they began the climb, finding handholds in the ancient rock. "You could have played innocent. They might have believed you." Eve gripped a jutting stone, pulled herself up another foot. Already her hands were raw, her riding skirt a dangerous encumbrance. "They were going to hang you for something you didn't do." "That's not an answer." She paused, looking down at him. From this angle, his scars were less visible, and she could see the man he might have been before whatever fire had marked him. "My father was a doctor. He used to say that standing by while evil happens makes you part of it." "Your father sounds wise." "He was, until he stood up to the wrong people." She resumed climbing, the memories sharp as the rocks beneath her palms. "Railroad men wanted our land. He refused to sell. They burned our barn, shot our stock. When that didn't work, they burned the house, with him in it." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Just help me understand how men like Crow sleep at night." "They don't see us as people," Jonah said simply. "Makes it easier." They reached a ledge and rested, sharing the last of the water. Below, dust plumes showed their pursuers had found the canyon, were casting about for tracks. Eve tried to steady her breathing, to push down the fear that wanted to overwhelm her. "Tell me about Raven Mesa," she said. Jonah's shoulders tensed. "What do you know about that?" "Rumors, whispers, that Crow burned out a whole settlement." "Not rumors." His voice was flat, distant. "Truth. 40 families, mostly Mexican and Apache mixed bloods. They'd found a good water source. Started building. Crow wanted that water for his cattle." He touched his scarred face, an unconscious gesture. "I was scouting for the army then, between enlistments. Saw the smoke from 10 miles off. By the time I got there, He shook his head. Fire moves fast in drought. Parents were trying to get their children out, but the smoke, the heat. I went in again and again. Saved 9 kids before a burning beam caught me across the face. Eve felt her throat close. That's how you got these, badge of honor, Crow calls them. Says they make me look like what I really am. His laugh was bitter. Maybe he's right. He's not. The words came fierce, surprising her with their vehemence. You saved children. That makes you more human than he'll ever be. Jonah studied her for a long moment, then pointed to a distant formation. There's water there, hidden spring. We can rest, tend the horses. They climbed down the far side of the ridge as the sun reached its zenith, heat pressing down like a flat iron. Eve had never been this far into the Badlands, had only heard the stories, flash floods that came from nowhere. Rattlesnakes thick as fence posts, the bones of those who'd gambled against the desert and lost. But Jonah moved through it like he belonged, reading signs in broken twigs and shifted stones that might as well have been Hebrew to Eve. He found game trails where she saw only chaos, water where she expected dust. The spring was barely more than a seep, but it was clear and cold, pooling in a natural basin carved by centuries of patient erosion. They let the horses drink first, then refilled their canteens. Eve wanted to plunge her whole head into that blessed coolness, but Jonah cautioned restraint. Too much too fast will make you sick. Trust me on this. She did, she realized. Trust him. This man she'd freed on little more than instinct and a sense of justice. As if reading her thoughts, he said, We need to talk about what comes next. They'll hunt us both now. Your husband won't let this stand. He's not. Eve stopped, the words dying. Thomas was her husband. Whatever else he might be. I know. I can take you to Fort Selden. You'd be safe there. Could start over. Without my things, without my work, just another runaway wife depending on charity. She shook her head. That's not a life. Better than being dead. Is it? She met his eyes. I've been dying by inches since I put on this ring. At least now I'm moving. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and they both looked up. Clouds were building over the western mountains, dark and promising. Storm coming, Jonah said. Could be good for us. Cover our tracks. Could be bad if it flash floods. As if to emphasize his point. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. In the desert, storms were both blessing and curse, bringing life-giving water and deadly torrents in equal measure. They moved on, pushing deeper into the maze of canyons and washes. The horses were tiring, and Eve's body ached in places she'd forgotten existed. But stopping meant capture, and capture meant death for Jonah, disgrace for her. The storm hit as they were crossing a wide wash, the sky opening like a sluice gate. In seconds, Eve was soaked, her hair plastered to her head, visibility reduced to mere feet. Jonah grabbed her horse's bridle, shouting something lost in the thunder. Then she heard it a sound like a freight train where no train could be. Flash flood. The desert's sudden fury. Tons of water and debris racing down from the high country, scouring everything in its path. The walls. Jonah pointed to a series of ledges cut into the canyon side. Climb. They abandoned the horses, no time for sentiment when seconds meant survival. Eve scrambled up the rock face, Jonah pushing her from behind when her strength flagged. The roar grew louder, and she risked a look back. A wall of brown water, 15 feet high and studded with entire trees, thundered down the wash. Their horses were swept away in an instant, tumbling like toys in the maelstrom. If they'd been 30 seconds slower. Jonah pulled her higher, finding a shallow cave where they could shelter. They pressed back against the stone, watching nature's violence play out below. The flood raged for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, leaving behind a transformed landscape when it finally subsided. Well, Jonah said finally, we're alive, but horseless, Foodless, and they'll still be hunting when this clears. One problem at a time. He was already moving, exploring their shelter. Look here, old fire rings. This was a camping spot. Probably Apache. Might be supplies cached. There were dried meat and corn, a water gourd, even a rough blanket. Someone's emergency store, left according to the old ways for travelers in need. We'll replace it when we can, Jonah said, noting her expression. The people understand necessity. As darkness fell and the storm moved east, they made a small fire, careful to use dry wood that wouldn't smoke. Eve found herself studying Jonah in the flickering light, this man who moved between worlds with such ease. You're not what they say you are, she said. Neither are you. He handed her a strip of dried meat. Proper wives don't usually spring prisoners and run off into the desert. Maybe I was never as proper as I pretended. Or maybe, he said quietly, you were just waiting for a reason to stop pretending. The fire crackled between them, and Eve felt something shift in her chest. Out here, with her old life washed away as surely as those horses, she could almost imagine being someone else. Someone who chose her own path instead of following the one laid out by others. Tomorrow we head for Pueblo Crossing. Jonah said, I have friends there, people who'll help. After that, we figure out how to prove your innocence. He looked skeptical. And how do you propose to do that? By finding out who really robbed the Garrison Ranch? Crow was awful quick to pin it on you. Makes me wonder what he's hiding. You're talking about going up against the most powerful man in the territory. I'm talking about justice. She pulled the blanket closer. My father would understand. Jonah was quiet for a long time, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this smart. Crow's got the law in his pocket. Not all of it, Eve said, thinking of Marshall Bennett in Silver City, one of the few honest lawmen left. Just the parts he can buy. They settled in for the night, taking turns keeping watch. Eve dozed fitfully, starting at every sound, but when she woke in the pre-dawn darkness, she found Jonah had covered her with his coat, taking the cold on himself. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Here was a man who'd been branded monster, who had every reason to trust no one, yet still possessed such simple kindness. As the first light touched the canyon walls, painting them rose and gold, Eve made her decision. She pulled off her wedding ring, weighing it in her palm. Such a small thing to carry such weight. Second thoughts, Jonah asked, watching her. Third and fourth thoughts, she admitted. But no, I'm done being what others expect me to be. She drew back her arm and threw the ring as hard as she could into the wash below, where flood-scoured sand would bury it with all the other detritus of violent change. Now what? Jonah asked. Eve stood, brushing dust from her ruined skirt. Now we prove that the real monster in Carson Gulch has been hiding behind a sheriff's star and a cattle brand. They set off on foot as the sun climbed, two unlikely allies bound by circumstance and choice. Behind them, Pike and his men would be regrouping, planning their next move. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and slim hope. But for the first time in months, Eve felt truly alive. The desert had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was time to test herself against men who thought power gave them the right to destroy lives. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp with possibility. And somewhere in that clarity, justice waited to be uncovered, one truth at a time. Carson Gulch looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. Eve pulled her borrowed shawl tighter, the rough wool nothing like her own fine things. But that life seemed a century ago now. 3 days in the wilderness with Jonah had changed her. Her hands were rough, her face sun-darkened, her resolve hardened like leather in the desert heat. You sure about this? Jonah whispered beside her. They crouched behind the mission wall, watching May's boarding house across the dusty street. May will help. She's got no love for Crow, Eve touched the small pistol Jonah had taught her to use, tucked now in her waistband. Besides, we need those witness statements if we're going to prove anything. Jonah nodded, though his expression remained troubled. They'd argued about this, him wanting to keep her safe. Her insisting safety was an illusion now anyway. In the end, practicality won. Eve knew the town, knew who might talk and who'd sell them out for Crow's silver. She slipped across the street, keeping to shadows. The town was changing, she could feel it in the nervous energy. See it in the extra guards posted outside Crow's warehouses. Her escape with Jonah had stirred something, upset the careful balance of fear and compliance that kept Carson Gulch in line. May's back door was unlocked, as always. Eve eased inside, navigating by memory through the familiar kitchen. She found May in her parlor, mending by lamplight, her weathered face creasing in shock then relief. "Lord have mercy, child. We thought you were dead." Not yet. Eve sat heavily, suddenly aware of her exhaustion, though not for lack of trying on Crow's part. May set aside her sewing, hands trembling. "Thomas has been near mad, tearing the town apart looking for you. Crow's got him convinced that savage—" She stopped, seeing Eve's expression. "That Mr. Reyes kidnapped you." "Jonah saved my life, more than once." Eve leaned forward. "May, I need the truth about what happened the night the Garrisons were robbed. Who was really there?" May's eyes darted to the windows. "Eve, honey, you don't understand. Crow's got the whole town under his thumb now. He's bringing in more men, guns. Says it's to protect us from outlaws, but we both know better." Eve gripped the older woman's hands. "Please, May, people are going to die if we don't stop this." May was quiet for a long moment, then rose and went to her desk. From a hidden compartment, she withdrew a folded paper. "Sam Hendricks left this with me before he took his family east. Said someone might come asking." Eve unfolded the statement, her heart racing. Sam's careful handwriting detailed what he'd seen that night, 3 men leaving the Garrison ranch. And none of them Jonah Reyes. The descriptions were clear: one man with a distinctive limp, another missing 2 fingers on his right hand. "Jake Morrison and Will Tanner," May supplied quietly. "Crow's men, Sam saw them clear as day, but when he tried to tell the sheriff—" She shrugged. "Well, you know how that goes." "This is evidence, real evidence." Eve folded the paper carefully. "Are there others who saw—" "Maybe, but they're scared. Eve, Crow's been making examples. The widow Martinez spoke up about seeing those men near her place that same night next day. Her well was poisoned. Livestock started dying. He can't threaten everyone." "Can't he?" May went to the window, peering through the curtains. "You haven't been here, haven't seen what it's become. He's hired more guns, men with dead eyes and ready triggers. And Thomas—" "What about Thomas?" May turned back, her face grave. "He's been drinking more, talking wild. Says when he finds you, he'll make you understand your place. Crow's been filling his head with poison, promising him the sheriff's star if he brings you back." Eve felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd known Thomas was weak, but this transformation into Crow's creature was complete. "There's more, isn't there?" "Smart girl." May returned to her desk, pulling out a ledger. "I've been keeping track. Money coming through town, men arriving on the late stage and going straight to Crow's ranch. Whatever he's planning, it's bigger than just covering up a robbery." Eve studied the entries, her mind racing. The patterns were clear. Crow was building a private army. But why? What did he need that much firepower for? "The railroad," she breathed. "It's coming through next year. The route hasn't been finalized yet. And whoever controls the water controls where that railroad goes." May finished. Raven Mesa had the best water for 50 miles. Now Crow's got it. The pieces clicked together. Rob the Garrison payroll. Blame it on an outsider. Use the fear to consolidate power, then cash in when the railroad came through. Simple, brutal, Effective. I need to get to Reverend Abel, Eve said. He's got influence with the territorial governor. May shook her head. Abel's been cowed. After you disappeared, Crow had Pike pay him a visit, suggested the church might burn down if the good reverend didn't mind his sermons. Then who? Eve stopped as footsteps sounded on the porch. Heavy boots. Multiple men. May's face went white. The root cellar, she hissed. Quick! Eve grabbed the papers and dove for the cellar door just as the front entrance burst open. Through a crack in the floorboards, she could see boots, 3 sets. 1 pair fine leather with silver spurs. Mrs. Hutch, Thomas's voice, slurred with drink and something darker. Heard you had a late-night visitor. Deputy Hale. May's voice was steady. Bless her. Just me and my mending, as you can see. Funny. Could have sworn I saw someone slip in here. This from Pike, his tone oily with threat. You wouldn't be harboring fugitives, would you? I harbor anyone who pays their rent on time. A crash. Someone had swept May's sewing to the floor. Eve bit her lip to keep from crying out. See, that's the wrong answer. Thomas said, my wife's out there somewhere. Probably scared. Definitely confused. That beast has her turned around. Made her think wrong. When I get her back, she'll understand, but anyone who helps her stay lost. Another crash. China breaking. I don't know where Eve is, May said firmly. But if I did, I'd tell her to keep running, because what I see in front of me isn't a husband worried about his wife. It's a dog doing tricks for his master. The slap echoed through the floor. Eve gripped the pistol, fighting the urge to charge up there, but that would only get them both killed. Watch your tongue, woman. Pike growled. Mr. Crow don't take kindly to disrespect. Then Mr. Crow can come tell me himself, instead of sending his trained monkeys. There was a long, dangerous pause. Then Thomas spoke, his voice cold sober now and more frightening for it. When I find her, and I will find her, maybe I'll bring her here first. Let you see what happens to wives who forget their place. Might be educational. The boots retreated, the door slamming behind them. Eve waited, counting to 100 before emerging. May sat on the floor, holding a hand to her reddened cheek. Oh, May. Eve knelt beside her. I've had worse. But her hands shook as Eve helped her to a chair. You need to go, child. They'll be watching now. Come with me. It's not safe. This is my home. I've buried 2 husbands in the cemetery yonder, and I'll not be run off by the likes of Crow. May gripped Eve's hands. But you need to be smart. That paper trail I showed you. There's more. Crow keeps records in his office safe. Transactions, bribes. All of it. Man's so proud of his clever dealing. He writes it all down. How do you know? Because Eliza Crow comes here when her husband's fists get too free. Amazing what a woman will say when she's hurt and alone. May stood, moving to her kitchen. Take these supplies. There's a way into Crow's house through the old mine shaft. Connects to his wine cellar. Eliza told me he uses it sometimes for private business. Eve packed quickly while May sketched a rough map. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky pale orange. Time was running out. What about the witnesses, the ones too scared to talk? Leave that to me, May said. I've got my own ways of encouraging folks. You just focus on getting that evidence. And Eve, she paused. Your friend, Reyes, I misjudged him. When you see him, tell him he's got at least one friend in Carson Gulch. Eve hugged the older woman tight, then slipped out the back way. The town was stirring, merchants opening shops, cowboys heading for breakfast. Normal life continuing while underneath, rot spread like gangrene. She made it to the rendezvous point, an abandoned miner's shack in the hills just as full daylight arrived. Jonah emerged from the shadows, relief clear on his scarred features. Any trouble? Eve showed him the papers, explained what she'd learned. His expression darkened with each revelation. A private army. That explains the men I've been seeing, moving through the canyons at night. He studied May's map. This is dangerous. Eve, Crow's house is a fortress. Fortresses have fallen before. Not to seamstresses and broken-down scouts. Eve looked at him sharply. Is that what we are? Because from where I stand, we're the only ones willing to fight for what's right. Jonah was quiet, then nodded slowly. You're right. I've been running so long. I forgot what it felt like to stand for something. He touched his scarred face. After Raven Mesa, I told myself I was done with causes, but maybe some things are worth the risk. Maybe they are. Eve felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared purpose. May's organizing the witnesses. If we can get Crow's records, combine them with testimony, we'd have enough for a federal marshal, maybe even the territorial governor. Jonah's eyes lit with possibility. End this before more blood spills. They spent the day planning, preparing. Jonah sketched the layout of Crow's ranch from memory, marking guard positions and routines. Eve practiced with the pistol until her aim was true. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, they were ready. Whatever happens tonight, Jonah said as they prepared to leave, I want you to know what you've done. What you're risking, it matters. Eve met his eyes. My father used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear. Your father sounds like someone I would have liked to meet. You'd have understood each other. Eve checked her weapons one last time. Both of you trying to save people who didn't always want saving. They set off into the gathering darkness. Two unlikely allies bound by purpose and growing trust. Behind them, Carson Gulch prepared for another night under Crow's heel. But change was coming, carried on desert wind and determination. The powerful had held sway too long, built their empires on fear and blood. Now it was time for accounting. For justice delayed but not denied. Eve thought of her wedding ring, lost now in flood-scoured sand, and felt only relief. She'd traded a false security for a dangerous truth, and found herself in the exchange. The moon rose full and bright, a searchlight in the desert sky. By its light, two figures moved through the shadows toward a reckoning years in the making. The house of cards Randall Crow had built was about to face its first real wind, and Eve intended to blow it down. The ruins of Raven Mesa stood like broken teeth against the morning sky. Eve knelt in the ash-grayed earth, her fingers sifting through debris that had once been homes, dreams, lives beside her. Jonah worked methodically, his face carved from stone as he uncovered remnants of the past. Here, he said quietly, pulling a half-melted metal buckle from the dirt. The letters RC were still visible despite the fire damage. Randall Crow. Fancy piece for a cattle baron to lose at a fire he supposedly wasn't at. Eve carefully wrapped the evidence in cloth. They'd been at this since dawn, documenting what the desert hadn't reclaimed. Shell casings from Army-issue rifles the kind Crow's men carried. Shattered bottles that had held kerosene. The truth was written in ash and ruin for those willing to read it. Eve Senor Jonah, a child's voice carried across the wasteland. Maria Delgado, no more than 8, came running with her brother Carlos close behind. Their family was camped a mile back, part of the group of displaced farmers who'd agreed to meet them here. What is it, pequeña? Jonah's voice gentled when speaking to children, a softness that seemed to surprise him. Mama says come quick. The German family has arrived, and they have stories. The camp was a collection of weathered wagons and patched tents, but the people within them carried themselves with quiet dignity. Heinrich Müller stood at the center, his wife Greta beside him, addressing the gathered families in accented but clear English. Saw them that night with our own eyes. 3 men on Crow horses, riding hard from the garrison place. One dropped this. He held up a distinctive silver concho. My boy found it next morning. Eve stepped forward. Would you swear to this in court? Mr. Muller. The German farmer's jaw set. They burned us out, took our land, killed our milk cow so our children went hungry. Yes, I will swear to anything that is truth. One by one, others came forward. The Sanchez family had seen Crow's men scouting the Garrison Ranch days before. Old Tom Waters, a prospector, had overheard Pike and Morrison laughing about easy pickings in a saloon. Each piece small, but together they painted a damning picture. "It's not enough," said a voice from the crowd. James Cooper, his arm still bandaged from defending his claim against Crow's men. "Evidence don't mean nothing if the judge is bought and paid for." "That's why we need Crow's own records," Eve said. "May Hutch says he keeps everything bribes, land grabs, even murder for hire. We get those. We go straight to the federal authorities." "And who's gonna bell that cat?" Cooper demanded. "Crow's got 20 guns at his ranch now, maybe more." "We are." Jonah stepped beside Eve. "Tonight." A murmur ran through the crowd. These people had suffered, lost everything to Crow's greed, but fear still held them tight. "You're one man with a scarred face and a death warrant." Someone called out, "She's a woman who abandoned her husband. What chance do you have?" Eve felt anger flare. "What chance did any of you have alone? They picked us off one by one, burned a farm here, poisoned a well there, always with some excuse, some legal cover. We stay divided, we stay beaten." "She speaks truth," said an old Apache woman, White Dove, who'd lost 3 grandchildren in the Raven Mesa fire. "The eagle may be strong, but even eagles fall to many crows working together." "I'm not asking you to fight," Jonah added. "Just be ready to testify when we bring the evidence back. Stand together when it matters." Slowly, reluctantly, heads began to nod. Cooper spat in the dust. "All right, but if you get yourselves killed, don't expect us to mourn long. We got our own troubles." As the group dispersed to share food and stories, Eve found herself teaching Sofia Delgado how to properly load a rifle. The girl was quick, determined, reminding Eve of herself at that age before the world had tried to box her into proper shapes. "Why do you help us?" Sophia asked. "You could have nice life in town. Pretty dresses, soft bed." Eve checked the girl's grip, adjusting her stance. "Because the nice isn't the same as right, and pretty dresses don't mean much when they're bought with other people's blood. My papa says you're brave, but Mama says you're loco." The girl grinned. "I think maybe both." "Maybe both," Eve agreed, ruffling Sophia's hair. "Now, remember, squeeze slow. Don't jerk. The gun should surprise you when it fires." Across the camp, Jonah was deep in conversation with the men, sketching maps in the dirt. Eve watched him work, noted how the children gravitated toward him despite his scars, how the women nodded when he spoke. This was a man who'd earned respect through action, not fear. As afternoon wore toward evening, they prepared to leave. The camp would move at dawn, heading for safer ground near Fort Selden, where Crow's reach was weaker. But first, Eve and Jonah had work to do. "Take this." Greta Muller pressed a wrapped bundle into Eve's hands. "Is bread dried meat? You'll need strength." Others came forward with offerings: ammunition, a better knife, a hand-drawn map of shortcuts through the hills. People who had almost nothing sharing what little they possessed. "Why?" Eve asked White Dove, who'd given her a beautifully beaded medicine pouch. "Because you see us," the old woman said simply. "In town, we are invisible, problems to be solved or removed. But you see people. That is rare gift." As they prepared to mount their borrowed horses, Thomas appeared. Eve's hand went to her gun, but Jonah touched her wrist, a gentle restraint. Her husband, could she still call him, that looked haggard, his badge tarnished, his clothes dusty from hard riding. "Quite the army you've assembled," he said, his voice bitter. "Mexicans, Indians, failed farmers, the dregs Crow was cleaning out. People, Eve corrected. Just people trying to live. Thomas. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. The camp had gone silent, weapons appearing in ready hands. I could arrest you both right now, bring a posse back, scatter this rabble. You could try, Jonah said mildly. Thomas's laugh was hollow. Yeah, I could try, except... He reached into his jacket, and Eve tensed, but he pulled out only a folded paper. Except I'm tired of being Crow's dog. Eve took the paper warily. It was a signed confession, Thomas admitting to falsifying evidence against Jonah, to covering up the real perpetrators of the Garrison robbery. Why? She asked. Because I looked in the mirror this morning and didn't recognize the man staring back. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. Because I realized I'd become everything I once swore to fight against. Because... His voice cracked. Because I lost you the moment I raised my hand to you. And all Crow's promises can't fix that. This confession will destroy you, Eve said quietly. I'm already destroyed. This might at least do some good. He mounted his horse again. Crow's expecting a shipment tonight. Guns, ammunition, enough to outfit a small army. The mine shaft entrance May told you about. It'll be unguarded during the delivery. 1 hour after full dark. It's a trap, Jonah said. No? Thomas finally looked at Eve, and she saw genuine pain there. It's a man trying to remember who he used to be. I won't fight for you, but I won't fight against you either. That's all I can offer. He rode away without another word, his figure growing small against the vastness of the desert. Eve stood holding his confession, this paper that represented the death of one life and perhaps the birth of another. Do we trust him? Jonah asked. We trust the information and prepare for betrayal, Eve said, tucking the confession away safely. But I think he's finally choosing a side, even if it's just the side of stepping away. As the sun began its descent, painting the camp in shades of amber and rose, Eve felt the weight of what they were about to attempt, but looking around at these faces, hopeful, frightened, determined, she knew there was no turning back. Ready? Jonah asked, handing her the reins of her horse. No, Eve admitted. But that's never stopped us before. They rode out as shadows lengthened, two figures against an army of greed and corruption. Behind them, the camp began its own preparations, ready to move at dawn's first light. The Delgado children waved from their wagon, and Eve waved back, carrying their hope like armor. The desert swallowed them, vast and unforgiving, but also honest in its dangers. Here, survival depended on skill and determination, not on who could afford the most guns or buy the most influence. It was a harsh teacher, but a fair one. As they neared the hidden entrance to Crow's domain, Jonah pulled up beside her. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know these people. They're alive because of you. You gave them hope when they'd forgotten what it looked like. We gave them hope, Eve corrected, and they gave us purpose, fair trade. The moon was rising, full and bright. Time to beard the lion in his den, to take the fight to those who'd thought themselves untouchable. Eve checked her weapons, said a prayer to her father's memory, and prepared to commit what most would call suicide, but she called justice. The old mine shaft yawned before them like a mouth full of darkness. Somewhere beyond lay answers, evidence, the tools to topple a tyrant. Also danger, probably death. Certainly the end of any pretense of civilized resolution. Eve Harper, who'd once been satisfied with needle and thread, with a quiet life and a respectable marriage, looked into that darkness and smiled. She'd traded safety for truth, comfort for purpose, a wedding ring for a loaded gun. As they dismounted and prepared to enter the shaft, she thought about the families sleeping in patched tents, about children who deserved better than fear, about justice delayed but not forgotten. Still time to turn back, Jonah offered, though they both knew better. Never, Eve said, and led the way into darkness, toward a reckoning that would shake Carson Gulch to its foundations. Behind them, the desert waited, patient and eternal, ready to bear witness to whatever dawn would bring. The cattle yard stretched before them in the harsh noon sun, packed with Carson Gulch's citizens, some curious, others afraid, most simply caught between powers greater than themselves. Randall Crowe stood on a makeshift platform, his voice carrying over the crowd like a preacher selling damnation. "This man," he pointed at Jonah, who stood chained between two of Pike's men, "is a killer, a thief, and worse. He's corrupted a good woman, turned her against her lawful husband, against the very foundations of civilized society." Eve pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering but her steps steady. In her hands, she carried the evidence they'd risked everything to gather. Crowe's ledgers, the signed testimonies, the proof of his empire built on blood and lies. "Let him speak his piece," someone called out. "Man's got a right to defend himself." "Rights," Crowe laughed, ugly and sharp. "This beast forfeited his rights when he chose to live like an animal. Look at that face scarred by his own evil. Marks so decent folk know to keep clear." "Those scars?" Eve's voice rang out clear and strong as she stepped into the open space before the platform. "Came from saving children at Raven Mesa, children you left to burn when you torched their homes." A murmur ran through the crowd. Crowe's face darkened. "Mrs. Hale, come to your senses at last, ready to beg forgiveness from your husband." Thomas stood to Crowe's left, his badge catching the light, his hand resting on his pistol. But Eve saw the tremor there, the uncertainty in his eyes. "I've come to speak truth," Eve said, holding up the ledgers. "Truth about the Garrison robbery, about who really killed those men." "Lies!" Pike spat. "Desperate lies from a fallen woman." Eve opened the ledger, began reading in a clear voice. Names, dates, amounts paid, bribes to judges, payments to gunmen, land stolen through force and fraud. The crowd pressed closer, listening with growing unease. "Where'd you get that?" Crowe demanded. But Eve heard the first crack in his composure. "From your own safe, Mr. Crowe." Amazing how much evidence a man accumulates when he's proud of his crimes. "She's a thief as well as an adulteress," Crowe announced to the crowd. "Breaking into a man's home, stealing his private papers. Like you stole from the Garrison ranch." Eve pulled out the silver concho, the melted buckle, laying out the evidence piece by piece. "Jake Morrison dropped this concho running from the robbery. You lost this buckle at Raven Mesa, starting the fire that killed innocent people." The crowd was listening now, really listening. May Hutch stepped forward, then the Mullers, the Sanchez family, others who'd been too afraid to speak before. Safety in numbers, courage in company. "I saw Morrison that night," Sam Henderson said, his voice shaking but determined. "Saw him and Tanner and another man riding hard from the Garrison place." Lies. But Crowe's denial sounded hollow now. More voices joined in. Stories of intimidation, of wells poisoned and crops burned, of a reign of terror disguised as law and order. The crowd's mood shifted, anger beginning to override fear. "Enough," Crowe pulled his gun, pointing it at Eve. "This ends now. Sheriff Hale, arrest your wife for theft, sedition, and conspiracy." Thomas stepped forward, and Eve saw her life balanced on the edge of his choice. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and in that moment, she saw not the man he'd become, but the one he'd once been young, idealistic, believing in justice. "No," Thomas said quietly. "What did you say?" Crowe's gun swung toward him. "I said no." Thomas's voice grew stronger. "I've done enough of your dirty work. Crowe, arrest her yourself if you're so keen on it." The yard erupted. Pike went for his gun. But Jonah, despite his chains, managed to knock him down with a shoulder charge. Women screamed, men shouted, and in the chaos, A child's cry pierced the air. Little Sarah Henderson, no more than 6, had wandered too close to the platform. Pike's wild shot, meant for Jonah, sent splinters flying inches from her head. Without hesitation, Jonah threw himself between the child and Pike's next shot, chains clanking as he scooped her up and rolled behind a water trough. "He saved her," someone shouted. "The scarred man saved the little girl." The crowd's anger crystallized into action. May Hutch, all 5 feet of her, stood in front of the platform with a shotgun that had appeared from beneath her skirts. "That's enough violence in front of children. Any man pulls another gun answers to me." Other women joined her, forming a protective line. The German wives, the Mexican mothers, even some of the townswomen who'd been silent too long. They stood between the gunmen and their children, between the old way and whatever might come next. Eve found herself at the center of it all, still holding the evidence, still standing despite every reason to run. She looked at Thomas, who'd stepped down from the platform, his badge lying in the dust where he'd thrown it. "He's no beast," Eve's voice carried over the tumult. She reached for her wedding ring, that symbol of a promise made in ignorance, a chain forged of duty rather than love. With steady hands, she pulled it off. "I'd rather save an honest man than stay married to a coward." The ring arced through the air, landing in the dust at Thomas's feet. He stared at it, his face crumbling, but made no move to pick it up. "This is sedition," Crow screamed. "I'll have you all hanged, every last one of you." "With what authority?" A new voice, calm and carrying natural command. Reverend Abel stepped forward, and beside him, Marshal Bennett from Silver City, his federal badge gleaming. "I telegraphed the marshal last night. Mr. Crow, seems the territorial governor is very interested in your activities. You were supposed to be cowed." Crow snarled at the minister. "I had Pike explain the consequences." "Yes, you did." Abel's mild face hardened. "And I was cowed. May God forgive me. But Mrs. Harper reminded me that there are things worth more than safety. Truth, for instance. Justice. The lives of children who deserve better than your brand of law." Marshal Bennett's deputies moved through the crowd, professional and purposeful. "Randall Crow, you're under arrest for robbery, murder, and conspiracy. You too, Pike, any man who wants to join them. Keep your hand near your gun." The yard held its breath. Some of Crow's men calculated odds, weighed loyalty bought with silver against federal justice backed by rifles. One by one, hands moved away from weapons. Rats leaving a sinking ship. But Eve couldn't blame them. Everyone had to choose their moment of courage. "You think this changes anything?" Crow laughed as the shackles closed on his wrists. "I own this town. These people are sheep, and sheep need wolves to keep them in line." "No," Eve said, stepping close enough to see the rage in his eyes turn to something like fear. "They're not sheep. They're people who were afraid. And you fed on that fear. But fear breaks when folks stand together. You taught them that, in the end." As Crow and his lieutenants were led away, the crowd began to disperse, but slowly, as if waking from a long dream. Some went to comfort children, others to shake hands with neighbors they'd been too frightened to acknowledge. The women lowered their weapons but didn't put them away, a new vigilance born of hard lessons. Eve found herself standing with Jonah as the blacksmith worked on his chains. The scarred man who'd been branded monster stood patient while children pecked around his legs. Curious now rather than frightened. "That was a fool thing you did," Eve said softly, "throwing yourself at Pike." The child was in danger. He said it simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. The chains fell away with a final clang. Jonah rubbed his wrists, looking at the crowd that had once been ready to watch him hang. "What now?" "Now we rebuild," May said, joining them with her shotgun broken over her arm like a lady's parasol. "Without fear this time, without men like Crow deciding who lives and who dies based on the color of their skin or the size of their purse." Thomas approached hesitantly, the ring clutched in his fist. "Eve, I don't." Her voice was not unkind, but firm. "What we had is over. Thomas, you made your choices. I made mine. Maybe now we can both find who we're supposed to be." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll testify. Tell everything I know. It's not enough, but—" "It's a start," Reverend Abel said. "Redemption begins with truth, however painful." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Eve stood in that dusty yard and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the false hope of security bought with compromise, but real hope born of people choosing courage over comfort. "You'll stay?" she asked Jonah. "Help us rebuild." He touched his scarred face, that mark that had made him outcast. "If they'll have me." "They will," May said firmly. "Heroes come in all shapes. Mr. Reyes, about time this town learned that." Sarah Henderson tugged on Jonah's pants leg. When he knelt to her level, she reached out with a child's fearlessness and touched his scarred cheek. "Thank you for saving me," she said solemnly. "Mama says you're brave. I think so too." Jonah's eye misted, and Eve saw the walls he'd built against the world crack and crumble. Here was acceptance, not despite his scars, but because of what they represented: sacrifice, courage, the willingness to walk through fire for others. "Well," Pike called from the prison wagon, "enjoy your victory while it lasts. Men like us always come back. This town will beg for Crow's protection when the next threat comes along." "Maybe," Eve said, loud enough for all to hear. "But next time, we'll be ready. We'll stand together, and we won't trade our souls for safety." The wagon rolled away, taking with it the old order of Carson Gulch. What remained was a town scraped raw but ready to heal. People who discovered their own strength, and the possibility of justice delayed but not denied. As folks began to drift away, May organized the women to prepare food for an impromptu celebration. The Mullers volunteered their barn for dancing. Even some of Crow's former men, freed from his shadow, offered to help with the cleanup. Eve stood with Jonah as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Her wedding ring lay forgotten in the dust, a small circle marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. "No regrets?" Jonah asked. "None," Eve said, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and what I stand for." "And what's that?" She smiled, thinking of her father, of the oath she'd taken to do no harm, of the larger oath written on every human heart to stand for truth, protect the innocent, choose love over fear. "I stand for the people who can't stand alone," she said. "I stand for justice, even when it costs everything. And I stand for the radical idea that every person, scarred or smooth, rich or poor, any color the good Lord made them, deserves to live free from fear." The celebration was beginning. Fiddle music spilling from the barn, voices raised in something like joy. Tomorrow would bring challenges, rebuilding trust, establishing new law, healing old wounds. But tonight, Carson Gulch danced on the grave of tyranny. And in that dusty cattle yard where fear had ruled, hope planted its flag and claimed the ground for all who dared to stand together. The dust had barely settled on Carson Gulch's main street when the whispers began. Crow might be in chains, but his shadow still stretched long across the territory. Eve stood in the makeshift committee room May's parlor converted to a center of town planning, studying the map spread before them. "He's heading for Arizona," Sam Henderson reported, still dusty from his ride. "Took the southern route through Devil's Canyon. Marshal Bennett's telegram says Crow escaped during a staged ambush. 3 deputies dead." The room fell silent. Around the table sat the unlikely alliance that had toppled a tyrant May Hutch, Reverend Abel, the Mueller family, White Dove representing the displaced Apache families, and Jonah, his presence still causing some folks to shift uncomfortably. "How many men?" Jonah asked, already thinking tactically. 6, maybe 7. Pike's with him. and some others who slipped away before the marshal could round them up. Sam hesitated. They say Crow's got friends in Tucson, money hidden, enough to start over or come back stronger. Then we stop him before he gets there. Eve said, Thomas spoke from the doorway. He'd been helping rebuild, trying to earn back some measure of respect, but his presence still caused tension. This isn't our fight anymore. Let the Federals handle it. The Federals lost him, May pointed out tartly. And while they're writing reports and requesting more men, Crow's building his next empire. She's right, White Dove said, her weathered face grave. Men like him don't stay down. They find new territory, new victims, unless someone stops them permanent. Eve felt the weight of decision. They'd won a victory. But incomplete victories had a way of turning into future defeats. We know something the Federals don't. Where Crow keeps his reserves, his contacts. Thomas. Her former husband shifted uncomfortably. There's a place, Granite Pass, just over the Arizona line. Crow mentioned it once when he was drunk. Said he had insurance there, documents. Gold, names of judges he owned. Insurance he'll use to buy his way back to power. Jonah concluded, we get there first. We cut his legs out from under him. It's 2 days hard riding, Henderson said. Through Apache territory, desert, and worse. And that's if Crow doesn't have men watching the routes. I know shortcuts, White Dove offered. Old paths my people used before the boundaries were drawn by white men's maps. Dangerous, but fast. Eve looked around the table. I'm not asking anyone to come. This town needs rebuilding, needs its people here. Oh, shut up, girl, May interrupted. You think we came this far to let you ride off alone? Some of us are coming. And that's that. In the end, it was a smaller group that rode out at dawn Eve. Jonah, Sam Henderson, whose brother had died in the Garrison robbery, and, surprisingly, Thomas. White Dove guided them, her granddaughter Rosa translating when needed. The first day took them through landscapes Eve had never imagined. White Dove's paths wound through hidden canyons where ancient paintings marked the stone, past springs concealed by centuries of careful secrecy. They moved like ghosts, avoiding the main trails where Crow's lookouts might wait. That night, camped in a grove of cottonwoods. Thomas approached Eve as she tended the horses. Why did you let me come? She considered the question, hands still working. Because every person deserves a chance to choose who they become. You chose wrong before. Maybe you'll choose better now. I don't deserve. None of us deserve anything. Eve cut him off. We earn it, day by day, choice by choice. Stop looking back and start looking forward. Jonah materialized from the darkness, moving silent as his Apache teachers had shown him. Tracks ahead, fresh. 3 riders, moving fast. Crow's scouts, Sam asked. Maybe, or just travelers. Either way, we go careful. The second day brought challenges. A sandstorm rose from nowhere, forcing them to huddle against their horses. Bandanas wrapped tight against the scouring wind. When it passed, the landscape had changed. Dunes shifted into new configurations. This is why the paths stay secret. White Dove said through Rosa, the land itself guards them. They were refilling canteens at a hidden spring when the crack of rifles split the air. Eve dove behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead, chips of stone stinging her face. Well, well, Pike's voice echoed off the canyon walls. The seamstress comes calling. Crow said you might be stupid enough to follow. Eve counted muzzle flashes. 3 shooters, well positioned on the rim above. They were pinned. The spring their only water for miles. Give it up, Harper, Pike called. Walk away now, and we might let you live. That scarred devil with you, though he's got a date with a rope. Jonah had already disappeared, melting into the landscape like smoke. Eve caught Thomas's eye, saw him hefting his rifle with newfound determination. You know what your problem is. Pike, Eve called back. Buying time. You always assume people will act from fear. Never occurred to you we might act from principle. Pike's laugh was ugly. Principle that what you call spreading your legs for a half-breed killer. The insult was meant to provoke, make her angry and careless. Instead, Eve felt only cold clarity. She'd been called worse by better men. Words were just noise when you knew your own truth. A cry from above, one of Pike's men tumbling from his perch. Jonah's knife worked silent and efficient. The odds shifted. Sam and Thomas opened fire, keeping the remaining shooters busy while Eve circled wide, using every scrap of cover. She came up behind Pike just as he was drawing a bead on Jonah. No hesitation this time. She'd left hesitation in Carson Gulch with her wedding ring. The shot was clean. Pike spinning and falling, his rifle clattering into the ravine. The last gunman threw down his weapon, hands high. "Don't shoot, I'm done!" They left him tied, but alive, with water and directions to the nearest town. Death was Crow's way, not theirs. But they took his horse, his guns, anything he might use to cause more harm. Pike lived, though the wound was bad. Eve worked on him with professional detachment, stopping the bleeding, binding the shoulder. "Why?" he gasped. "I'd have let you die slow." "Because I'm not you," Eve said simply. "And that's the whole point." They made Granite Pass as the sun touched the western peaks. It was a narrow slash in the rocks, barely wide enough for single file, the perfect place for an ambush or for hiding secrets. The cave was where Thomas had said, concealed behind a fall of rocks. Inside, boxes of documents, bags of gold and silver, enough wealth to corrupt a dozen territories. "Burn it," White Dove said through Rosa. "Gold taken in blood brings only more blood." But Eve shook her head. "No, we take the documents evidence of every crime, every bribe. The gold goes back to the families he stole from. Justice, not vengeance." They were loading the pack horses when Crow appeared. He came alone, dust-covered and gaunt, his fine clothes torn by desert thorns. The gun in his hands shook with exhaustion or rage. "My life's work," he said, voice cracking. "Everything I built, everything I earned." "Stole," Sam corrected. "Everything you stole." "Same thing." Crow's laugh had madness in it. "You think this changes anything? There'll be another like me tomorrow, and another after that. Men with vision, with the strength to take what they want." "Maybe," Jonah said, stepping partially in front of Eve. "But there'll also be people to stop them. Every time." Crow's gun swung between them, indecisive. Eve saw the moment he decided not for any of them, but for Thomas, the traitor, the weak link who'd broken the chain. Time slowed. Crow's finger tightened. Thomas, recognizing his death, stood straighter instead of flinching, and Eve, acting on instinct older than thought, shoved Thomas aside as the gun roared. The bullet caught her high in the shoulder, spinning her around. She heard shouts, another gunshot, Jonah's voice calling her name, then darkness, soft and welcome as a blanket. She woke to firelight and pain. They'd made camp in a sheltered grove, and someone, Jonah, by the gentle competence, had cleaned and dressed her wound. "Crow?" she asked, throat dry. "Gone." Thomas sat nearby, his face haggard. "Jonah winged him, but he made it to his horse. The documents are safe, though we have everything." "You saved my life," Thomas continued. "After everything I did, why?" Eve tried to shrug, winced at the pain. "Told you, people deserve chances to choose better. Hard to choose if you're dead." White Dove appeared with a cup of something bitter but soothing. As Eve drank, the old woman spoke, Rosa translating softly. "The bullet passed clean. You'll heal, but carry the scar. Marks of courage are not to be ashamed of." Eve thought of Jonah's scarred face, of all the marks people carried from standing against evil. "I know." They returned to Carson Gulch 3 days later. Eve riding carefully, surrounded by friends who'd become family in the crucible of shared danger. The town turned out to meet them, and in their faces, Eve saw something new, not just relief or gratitude, but ownership. This was their victory, their town, their future to build. The documents went to federal prosecutors. Names and crimes laid bare. The gold was distributed according to an accounting May organized with scrupulous fairness. Some went to rebuilding Raven Mesa, some to families Crow had destroyed, some to starting a school where all children, Apache, Mexican, white, could learn together. And Crow himself. He vanished into the vast territories, wounded and alone, his empire dust. Some said he died in the desert. Others claimed to see him in border towns, a shadow of his former self, starting fights he couldn't finish. Eve didn't much care. He was gone, his power broken. That was enough. As her shoulder healed, Eve found herself planning, not just for herself, but for the town, for the future they were building together. The threads that would weave their community were visible now. Justice, courage, and the radical notion that standing together made them all stronger. One evening, as she sat with Jonah watching the sun paint the desert in shades of rose and gold, he asked, "Any regrets?" Eve touched her shoulder, feeling the new scar beneath the cloth. Another mark, another choice made visible. Not one. What now? Now we build something better. A place where people are judged by their actions, not their appearance. Where law means justice, not just power. Where children grow up free. She smiled. Think we're up for it? Jonah's scarred face crinkled in what she'd learned to read as joy. Together, I think we might be. The desert wind carried the scent of rain real this time. The monsoons finally breaking. Change was coming to Carson Gulch, washing away the old, nourishing the new. And Eve Harper, seamstress turned warrior turned builder of communities, was ready for whatever storms might follow. Granite Pass cut through the mountains like a wound, its narrow walls amplifying every sound, the scrape of boots on stone, the nervous snort of horses, the metallic click of weapons being checked. Eve pressed her back against the cold rock, her shoulder still tender from the barely healed bullet wound. Beside her, Jonah moved with practiced silence, reading the canyon like scripture. "He's up there," Jonah whispered, pointing to a ledge where shadow moved against shadow. 3 men with him, maybe 4. They'd tracked Crow for 2 days through increasingly hostile terrain. The documents they'd seized had revealed more than financial crimes. They'd shown a network of corruption stretching to Tucson, El Paso, even Mexico City. Federal Marshal Bennett had wired that unless they could bring Crow in alive to testify, dozens of guilty men would walk free. The ledge narrows ahead. Sam Henderson observed, studying the cliff face with a surveyor's eye. One man could hold it against an army, or be trapped by one. Thomas added, he'd proven himself repeatedly since leaving Carson Gulch, but Eve still saw others watching him, waiting for betrayal. The sound of falling pebbles made them freeze. Above, Crow's voice drifted down, raw with exhaustion and rage. "I know you're there. Harper, you and that scarred devil, come to finish what you started. Come to offer you a choice." Eve called back. "Surrender. Testify. Take your chances with a judge, or die here alone. Your legacy nothing but blood-stained dust." Crow's laugh echoed off stone. "Legacy, I built an empire. I took worthless desert and made it profitable. You took lives and made them worthless." Jonah responded, "There's a difference." More rocks fell, and Eve glimpsed movement, Crow's men repositioning. The sun was climbing, and soon the heat would be unbearable in this stone oven. They needed to move. I'll circle up," Jonah said. "Draw their fire. When they focus on me." "No," Eve gripped his arm. "No more splitting up. We do this together or not at all." Something passed between them, unspoken but understood. Too many times they'd risked everything alone. This time would be different. The old mine shaft, Thomas said suddenly. It connects to that ledge from below. Crow showed it to me once, bragging about his boat holes. And you're just remembering this now? Sam's voice held suspicion. I'm remembering a lot of things, Thomas replied quietly. Things I wish I could forget. But if I can do one right thing. He looked at Eve. The entrance is hidden behind those boulders. Narrow, but passable. Eve weighed the options. Trust Thomas and risk walking into a trap, or face Crow's guns in a direct assault. Above, she heard Crow ordering his men to prepare for an attack. Show us, she decided. The mine entrance was exactly where Thomas promised. A crack in the earth barely wide enough for a person. The air inside was stale, heavy with the memory of men who'd sought fortune and found only darkness. They moved in single file, Thomas leading, then Eve, Jonah, and Sam. The tunnel was a nightmare of sharp turns and unstable timbers. More than once. Eve felt the mountain groan around them. Tons of rock held back by rotting wood and hope. Here, Thomas whispered, pointing to a shaft leading upward. Faint light filtered down, and with it, voices. Told you we should have kept moving. Someone was saying, now we're trapped like rats. Shut up, Morrison. Crow snarled. They're amateurs playing at justice. When the sun gets high enough, they'll be blind looking up at us. Then we pick them off like rabbits. Eve started climbing, testing each handhold. The shaft was tight, forcing her to twist around her injured shoulder. Behind her, she heard Jonah's steady breathing, felt his presence like an anchor. They emerged into chaos. Thomas had led them true. They came up behind Crow's position, catching the outlaws focused on the canyon below. But Morrison, quicker than his reputation suggested, spun at the sound of displaced stone. Behind us. Gunfire erupted in the confined space. Eve rolled behind a boulder as bullets whined past. She saw Thomas go down, clutching his leg. Saw Sam firing steadily to cover him. Jonah moved like deadly poetry, his guns speaking a language older than words. Crow himself stood at the ledge's edge, magnificent in his madness, firing with both hands at shadows and stone. You think you've won, you think killing me changes anything. We're not here to kill you, Eve shouted over the gunfire. We're here to stop you. Same thing, Crow ejected spent casings, reloading with practiced speed. In this world, you're either the boot or the dirt beneath it. Morrison fell. Sam's shot catching him center mass. Another outlaw threw down his weapon, hands high, begging for mercy. But Crow fought on, retreating step by step toward the precipice. Eve saw the moment he realized he was beaten. His guns empty, his men down, nowhere left to run. She stood, her own weapon steady. It's over, Crow. He smiled then, a terrible expression on his patrician features. You're right, but I choose how it ends. Don't, Jonah started forward, but Crow was already moving. Not toward them, but backward, toward the edge. Eve lunged forward, some instinct older than thought driving her to prevent even this man from choosing death over justice. Her fingers caught his coat as he toppled. For a moment, they balanced on the edge of forever, Crow's weight dragging them both toward the abyss. Eve felt her feet slipping on loose stone, felt gravity's inexorable pull. Then Jonah's arm wrapped around her waist, anchoring her. Thomas, despite his wound, grabbed her belt. Sam added his strength. Together, they hauled both Eve and Crow back from the brink. Crow lay gasping, staring at Eve with something like confusion. You saved me. Why I destroyed your life, threatened everything you loved. Why? Eve caught her breath, aware of how close she'd come to following him over. Because justice isn't revenge. Because even you deserve to face what you've done in a court of law, not at the bottom of a canyon. Because... She looked at Jonah, at Thomas, at Sam. Because we're better than you taught us to be. The fight went out of Crow then, all his rage and pride crumbling like ancient adobe in rain. He didn't resist as they bound his hands, didn't speak as they tended wounds his and their own. Thomas's leg wound was clean, the bullet passing through muscle without hitting bone. As Eve wrapped it, he said quietly, "I thought you'd let him fall. Part of me wanted you to." "Part of me wanted to as well," Eve admitted. "But that's his way, not ours. We're building something different." The journey back tested them all. Crow, broken by his defeat and salvation, alternated between silence and rambling confessions. Names poured out, judges bought, lawmen corrupted, murders ordered with no more thought than branding cattle. Sam wrote it all down in his surveyor's notebook, evidence that would topple powerful men across 3 territories. On the second night, camped under stars sharp as glass, Crow asked Eve, "What happens to men like me in your new world?" "You face justice," she said simply. "Fair trial, fair sentence, a chance to make amends if you choose. And if I choose not to?" "Then you'll serve your time and fade into history. A cautionary tale about the price of treating people as property." Crow was quiet for a long moment. "I had a sister once, before I became this. She would have liked you. Had the same foolish notions about right and wrong being absolute things." "What happened to her?" "She married a farmer, died in childbirth on some worthless homestead, trying to scratch life from dirt." His voice held old pain. "I swore I'd never be powerless like that. Never let anyone I cared about be powerless." "So you became the thing that made others powerless," Jonah observed. "Became the boot instead of the dirt, like you said." It seemed logical at the time. Crow stared at the fire. Power was safety. Money was power. Simple equation. Except you forgot the most important variable. Eve said, "People, we're not equations to be solved or resources to be exploited. We're complicated." "Yes," Crow said softly. "You are that." They reached Carson Gulch to find the town transformed. Gardens bloomed where fear had planted only dust. The school rang with children's voices in 3 languages. May's boarding house had expanded, offering refuge to women escaping situations like Eve's had been. Marshal Bennett waited with a federal escort, proper chains, and official warrants. As they transferred Crow, he turned to Eve one last time. "That new world you're building, I hope it works. I hope it lasts." "It will," Eve said with quiet certainty, "because we'll teach our children better than we were taught. They'll know that strength isn't taking what you want, it's protecting those who can't protect themselves." The marshal's wagon rolled away, taking Crow to his reckoning. His trial would make headlines from Denver to Mexico City. His testimony would bring down a network of corruption decades in the making. But for Carson Gulch, his departure was simply the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. That evening, as the town celebrated in the plaza, Thomas approached Eve and Jonah. His leg was still bandaged, but he stood straight. "I'll be leaving tomorrow," he said. "Marshal Bennett says there's work for honest lawmen in the territories. If I'm willing to start fresh, earn my way back to wearing a badge." "That's good, Thomas," Eve said, meaning it. "Everyone deserves their chance at redemption." He held out a small box. "I've been carrying this since that day in the cattle yard. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Couldn't bear to keep it. Maybe you could," he gestured vaguely at the box, "do something useful with it." Inside was her wedding ring, cleaned and polished. Eve held it up to the light, this small circle that had once bound her to a life of quiet desperation. "Thank you," she said. "I know exactly what to do with it." Later, she and Jonah walked to the site of the new clinic they were building, a place where anyone could receive care regardless of ability to pay. Eve took the ring and placed it in the cornerstone before the mortar set. "From chains to foundation," Jonah observed. "Fitting." everything can be transformed. Eve said, "Given the chance and the choice." The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched Crow's empire rise and fall, that would watch whatever came next. But for now, there was music and laughter, children playing without fear, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served without vengeance. No killing, Jonah mused. We brought down Randall Crow without killing. Do you know how rare that is out here? It's how things should be, Eve said. How they will be, if we're strong enough to hold the line. Jonah smiled, his scarred face beautiful in its joy. We, Eve confirmed, taking his hand. All of us together, building something worth lasting. The celebration continued around them. A town reborn in hope and determination, and somewhere in the federal prison system. A broken emperor began the long journey toward understanding that power without compassion was just another name for poverty of the soul. The desert night wrapped around Carson Gulch like a blessing, and for the first time in memory, the town slept without fear. The morning sun painted Carson Gulch in shades of gold and possibility. 2 years had passed since Randall Crow's empire fell, and the town had transformed like the desert after rare rain life blooming where once only fear had taken root. Eve stood in the doorway of the clinic, watching the early patients arrive. Old Mrs. Chen with her arthritis, young Miguel Sanchez needing stitches from a carpentry accident, White Dove bringing her newest grandchild for a checkup. The building itself was modest adobe walls, tin roof, clean windows, but it represented something greater: healing without judgment, care without conditions. Morning rush already. Jonah emerged from the supply room, his scarred face creased in the gentle expression she'd come to love. He moved with easy confidence now, no longer hunching to hide his scars. The children of Carson Gulch had taught him that their innocent acceptance worth more than any medicine. Always is on Wednesdays. Eve checked her appointment ledger. May's bringing the sewing circle ladies for their health talks, and the Muller boys need their vaccinations. Speaking of the Mullers, Jonah nodded toward the window where Heinrich Muller approached with several other farmers. Town meeting tonight. They want to discuss the water rights proposal. The water, always in the desert, it came back to water, but now, instead of one man hoarding life itself, the community managed the precious resource together. The spring at Raven Mesa flowed free, irrigation channels spreading like veins to farms that had once scraped by on hope and morning dew. Mrs. Harper, Miss Eve, Sarah Henderson, now 8 and missing her front teeth, tugged at Eve's skirt. Mama says to thank you for the medicine last week. Her cough's all gone. Eve knelt to the child's level. That's wonderful news. You've been making sure she rests. Yes, ma'am. And I read to her from the book you lent us. Sarah's face glowed with pride. The school Another Victory had taught children who'd never expected to hold a book. As the morning progressed, Eve found herself thinking about journeys. Not the physical kind, though she and Jonah had made several, helping other towns resist their own crows, but the journeys of the heart. The woman who had once defined herself by her husband's name now stood on her own, known for her actions rather than her associations. Letter came, May announced, bustling in with her usual energy despite her 70 years. From Thomas. Eve accepted the envelope, recognizing the careful script. Thomas wrote every few months from his post in Colorado, where he served as a deputy under a marshal who believed in redemption through service. Dear Eve, she read aloud to Jonah and May. Thought you should know we arrested 2 men last week trying to establish a Crow-style operation here. Used everything I learned from our mistakes to stop them early. The sheriff says I have a gift for recognizing corruption. I told him I had expert teachers in what not to become. Thank you, again, for saving my life. Not from the bullet, but from the man I was becoming, your friend-in-law and in truth, Thomas Hale. Well, May said, dabbing at her eyes. That's something, isn't it? Man finds his spine at last. People can change. Eve said, folding the letter carefully. Given the chance and the choice, the afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A carriage, too fine for Carson Gulch's dusty streets, stopped outside the clinic. From it stepped a woman in elegant morning dress, her face hidden by a dark veil. Mrs. Harper. The voice was cultured, careful. I'm told you're the one to see about difficult situations. Eve exchanged glances with Jonah, then stepped forward. I'm Eve Harper. How can we help? The woman lifted her veil, revealing a face marked by fading bruises. My name is Catherine Morrison. My husband was one of Crow's men. The clinic fell silent. Jake Morrison killed in the shootout at Granite Pass, his widow standing here, seeking help from those her husband had tried to destroy. I know what he was. Catherine continued, chin raised despite her obvious fear. What he did. But I have children, Mrs. Harper, 2 daughters, and the men who took over his business interests. They say I owe them. Say my girls can work off the debt when they're older. Eve felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same righteous anger that had first driven her to free Jonah. Where are your daughters now? Hidden, with friends in Tucson. But I can't leave them there forever, and I have nowhere. Her voice broke. I have nothing, no skills except being a wife to a violent man. No friends except those who fear what knowing me might cost. You have skills, Eve said firmly. You survived. You protected your children. You found the courage to come here, knowing your husband's crimes. Those are not small things. May stepped forward. I've been thinking about expanding the boarding house again. Could use help managing it. Room and board plus wages, and your girls can attend the school. Catherine Morrison stared at them, tears tracking down her bruised face. Why? Why would you help me after what my husband— Because that's what we do here now, Jonah said quietly. We break cycles instead of continuing them. Your daughters deserve better than paying for their father's sins. And so Carson Gulch grew by 3 more souls, and the work continued. The days blended together in purposeful rhythm healing, teaching, building. The clinic expanded to include a proper surgery. The school added a library. The water flowed, carefully managed, to farms that prospered in measured abundance. But it was the smaller victories Eve treasured most. The first time someone shook Jonah's hand without flinching. The day White Dove's granddaughter and the Muller boy performed a duet at the Harvest Festival. Their voices blending in harmony their grandparents couldn't have imagined. The moment Catherine Morrison really laughed at something May said. The sound rusty but real. One evening, as the sun set in its nightly glory, Eve found herself at the cemetery, standing before a new headstone. They'd never found Crow's body after his escape from federal custody during a prison transfer. Some said he'd drowned crossing the Rio Grande, others that he'd vanished into Mexico. But the town had erected a marker anyway, not for the man, but for the lesson. Here lies the empire of fear, the stone read. May we remember and never repeat. Philosophical for a gravestone, Jonah observed, joining her. May's idea. She said we needed a reminder that even the mightiest tyrannies are mortal. They stood quietly, watching shadows lengthen across the desert. In the distance, Carson Gulch prepared for another peaceful night. Children called home for supper, merchants closing shops, the saloon piano starting its nightly dance. Do you ever regret it? Jonah asked. The life you might have had quiet, safe, conventional. Eve considered the question, though the answer had long been clear. I had that life. It was killing me slowly, one compromise at a time. This— She gestured at the town, the clinic, the man beside her. This is living messy, dangerous sometimes, but real. And us. His voice carried a vulnerability that few ever heard. No rings, no ceremonies, no papers saying what we are to each other. Eve took his hand, tracing the calluses earned through shared labor. I wore a ring once. It meant I belonged to someone else, that my worth was measured by my obedience. What we have, we choose each other every day, not because law or custom demands it, but because we want to. That's stronger than any paper. Jonah lifted her hand, kissed the palm with infinite gentleness. In my mother's tradition, there's a ceremony, not of binding, but of recognition. Two paths that choose to run together while remaining themselves. Would you consider that? Eve's throat tightened. Tell me about it. It happens at sunrise, at a place of water. The couple brings silver, not rings, but something crafted for the occasion. They speak their truths before the four directions. Pledge not ownership but partnership. The water witnesses, the sun blesses, and the paths continue together but distinct. Yes, Eve said simply. When? Spring equinox, when the desert blooms. Perfect. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of shared purpose. Though I should warn you, I'm terrible with silverwork. His laugh rumbled through his chest. Good thing I know someone who can teach you. White Dove's nephew is a master silversmith. Says he owes you for saving his son from that infected wound last winter. They walked back toward town as stars emerged in the darkening sky. The clinic would need them early tomorrow. The Ramirez baby was due any day. And the traveling preacher's family always brought interesting ailments from their circuit riding. At her small house built with her own hands and the help of neighbors, Eve paused at the door. Through the window, she could see the wooden box on her mantel. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay the evidence of her journey, her father's medical instruments, the bullet dug from her shoulder, the contract that had almost cost Jonah his life, and yes, even that wedding ring, retrieved from the clinic's cornerstone during expansion. Not trophies, but reminders that justice required action, that courage meant standing when your knees shook, that love, real love, liberated rather than confined. Coming in, she asked Jonah. May sent over her famous stew. In a moment. He stood looking out over Carson Gulch, this town that had transformed from a place of fear to one of hope. Just thinking about roads not taken. If you hadn't freed me that night. But I did. Eve touched his scarred cheek, feeling him lean into the caress. And you saved that child, and the town stood together, and here we are. No use borrowing sorrow from paths we didn't walk. Wise woman. Learning to be. Inside, over May's stew and fresh bread from the German bakery. They talked of mundane miracles, medical supplies needed ordering. The school roof wanted patching. 3 new families were arriving next week seeking fresh starts. The revolution was over. Now came the harder work of evolution. Later, as the town slept, Eve stood at her window, looking out at the place she'd helped remake. Somewhere, perhaps, Randall Crowe still lived, nursing his bitterness and schemes. But his shadow no longer fell across Carson Gulch. The town had found its own light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tonight, there was peace, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of choosing love over fear, community over division, justice over mere law. The desert wind sang through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. And Eve Harper, seamstress, healer, teacher, fighter, partner, smiled at the sound. She'd found her place at last, not through marriage or position, but through the simple act of choosing to stand for something larger than herself. The wedding ring might be gone, but what she'd gained in its place was beyond price, a life lived on her own terms, a love chosen freely each day, and a community that proved people could change person by person, choice by choice, until even the desert bloomed with hope. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, wild and free and unashamed. Eve listened to its song and understood. Some things were meant to be tamed. Others were meant to run wild, blazing trails for those who'd follow. She'd chosen her path, and she'd never looked back. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're driving through your own desert highways, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere in the American West where these events unfolded. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Night. Hit that like button and press the hype button to help more listeners discover these tales of courage, justice, and redemption in the Old West. Until our next adventure, partners.